This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before I jump into my guest today, I have a favor, a request, something that keeps me motivated. Keeps me motivated to keep doing the podcast, and that is go check out one of my books. Go to Amazon. Pick up the newest edition of Trend Following, 2017 hardcover. Pick up the newest edition of Turtle Trader, a special audiobook that includes an interview with Jerry Parker, the most successful of the original Turtles, only in my Turtle Trader audiobook. Oh, and it doesn't stop there. Once you buy one of my books, please, gosh, that's a lot of pleases, write a review. Give me some praise. Give me some love. Go say something. Oh, but hold on. I'm going to be somewhat neutral here. If you are a psychotic person, if you're a lunatic, I want you to go review the book too, because I love to see those people that are in full-blown cognitive dissonance, like literally in their mom's basement, going crazy because something I wrote caused them to burst inside. One of the best possible feelings that an author can have. Now, my guest today, I don't know what he will think of that setup. It's not related to him. But my guest today, a very interesting guy, Daniel Klein. He is an American professor of economics at George Mason University, my alma mater. And for those of you that don't know, George Mason University, the hotbed, ground zero of the libertarian economic thought. Today, there is more stuff going on at my alma mater, at George Mason University. If you're interested in liberty, this is the university to be at, hands down. Today, Daniel and I discuss all things liberty. We dive into a little bit of Smith, a little bit of Hume. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about this conversation, once we both got warmed up, was the diving into classical liberalism. Not liberalism as used today in modern America, but the classical version, which is where I see myself. It's where my guest today, Daniel Klein, sees himself. Look, words mean things. It's the way we communicate. And I think, you know what? Even if we have differences of opinion, we should all at least agree what these damn words mean. Then we can move somewhere. We can maybe agree or disagree or whatever, but I think we have to, at least as a civilized group of apes, which is what we are, let's agree on the damn terms. Without further delay, let me jump right into my guest today, Daniel Klein. Liberty. When was the age? Give me an age where you saw this word, you embraced it, and you kind of knew that this was really big for you and it was going to be in you for a long time.
Regarding my own personal intellectual development, discovery of liberal ideas, it does come from personal experience. I was very, very dissatisfied with school throughout most of my childhood. I was playing ping pong with a friend of mine one day. This is a friend who, you know who this person is. You know this person. He was very advanced. We're the same age, but he was very advanced in thinking about such things and intellectual things generally. And he said to me, "Have you ever thought about why school sucks?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? I mean, the teachers treat you like children and it's boring and it's obvious why it sucks." He says, no, why it sucks. And I said, no, why? Why does it suck? And he explained to me that it's because basically children are assigned to schools. They have no choice. The schools are government operations. There's no private ownership. They don't compete with each other. The people running the school are not really responsible for the resources that they use, in the sense that they have no ownership or residual claimancy to them, et cetera, et cetera. And this made perfect sense to me. I found it extremely powerful. Now I kind of saw it as sort of like a government, basically a socialist operation that really very neatly explained why school was so bad. So that kind of thinking then about private ownership, about free enterprise, about choice, competition, just made a lot of sense to me. So I fell in at that time pretty directly with free market economics and so on. And so then I discovered libertarianism, Austrian economics, and those things. So that's how it got started.
Take me back in time, though, because you had to go back in time. Place for me, lay it out on the chessboard when you started getting exposed to these Scottish philosophers that all passed away in the 1700s. I mean, these guys were really, I'm talking about Adam Smith, Hume, some of the people that you've done tremendous amounts of work yourself inside of their work, expanding it. How did that start to happen to take you to that time period?
I graduated high school in 1980. I kind of came of age intellectually, I'd say, when libertarianism was coming together or had begun to come together. New York area, Murray Rothbard type circles, Austrian economic circles. And I was very much involved and connected with those circles. So I started off in sort of a libertarian Austrian economics vein. It wasn't so long in college that I became quite skeptical about the way Mises and Rothbard think and argue their image of science. I didn't really buy so much into the Austrian economics project and identity. I saw it more as just a matter of sort of liberty or liberalism or libertarianism, I would have said at that time. I gradually discovered Adam Smith just through study and so on, but it took many years. My thinking about the merits of the 20th century figures evolved quite a bit, and I discovered more and more what I found to be the merits of several of the 18th century thinkers. And I actually feel that they're, in some sense, better.
You're speaking like a Hayek. No, you mean like the Hume and the Smith.
Yeah, 18th century is Hume and Smith, for example, and especially. Hayek, I think, is my favorite of the 20th century, and I see him as more in the spirit of Hume and Smith. I actually think that Hayek is closer to Smith than he is to Mises, so I dehomogenize Mises and Hayek, as other people do, some other people do. And that kind of move makes you more dubious about sort of the Austrian project that tries to homogenize Hayek and Mises.
Since you are at one of the best institutions to go learn these subjects, you are helping young students to learn. Many people listening to this show are going to have some basic Adam Smith insights. They're going to think of the invisible hand, the wealth of nations. They're going to know some things. I would love for you, as we go through a few of these names, for example, Smith, Hayek, Hume, give me a little of your kind of greatest hits perspective on Smith and why he's so important today.
I think Hume and Smith are seeing the emergence in their own day, and they feel it, a commercial society with a liberal orientation in the culture and in the political arrangement. They're trying to move it that way. And they're thinking about how all these things fit together in political culture, government and society, and so on, in a quite profound way. So they are developing their ideas for free enterprise economics, very much connected to these larger questions of political culture, organization, the culture, society in general, whether liberalization is actually a good thing for society in general. I think they were very aware of many of its downsides which I think are hard to capture and express in narrow economics, downsides having to do with the sort of discohesion of society, the fragmentation, the breaking up of community, the loss of meaning, and so on. I think they were quite aware of those kind of dangers. Now, we, from our position here today, can actually look back and see that those are some of the very complaints that people like Karl Polanyi leveled, most vigorously against the liberal developments that he had seen. He was writing in the 1940s. They are very concerned with sort of the moral cohesiveness of the individual, the moral coherence, perhaps you could say, of the individual. And so they were, I think, interested in developing their liberal political view in relation to how it can work with government institutions and the political culture. One of the things that makes a contrast with 20th century libertarian thought is that they developed not only the idea of a presumption of liberty, the burden of proof in a policy argument should be placed on the one who wants to reduce liberty. Libertarians today, naturally see that and feel that. That's part of being libertarian today. They also gave a presumption to the status quo, and that conflicts with the presumption of liberty when the reform on the table is an augmentation of liberty, is a liberalization. Now, in some sense, the person who wants to defend the status quo might be said to have the burden of proof because they're objecting to this liberalization. See, the presumption of liberty would say, hey, you defender of the status quo, you have to bear the burden of proof about why we shouldn't make this liberalization. But the other presumption, the presumption of the status quo, puts it on the liberalizer. Hey, you want to change the status quo, you bear the burden of proof about why we should change the status quo. And I think both of these presumptions significant place in Hume Smith, you see. And so there's a tension there for reforms that liberalize, that augment liberty. And I just think they understood those kind of tensions. Notice, by the way, that these two presumptions stand together, shoulder by shoulder, against reforms that reduce liberty. In that case, the person who wants to reform and reduce liberty is being placed with the presumption, or the burden of proof, rather, on them by both of those two presumptions. So the idea of like the status quo as in some ways actually privileged and enjoying a presumption is something that is in Hume Smith, and I would say 18th liberal thought, 20th century libertarian thought. So that's one significant thing. Related to that is that Hume and Smith are less destinational. They are not so concerned with, okay, so what's like the proper scope of government? What is, the right blueprint for what government should actually be? And then we'll condemn all those deviations from that and talk about how society should be, a minimal government state or whatever. Rather than being destinational, which, many libertarians are, they're more directional. There's a sense of, again, an emphasis on the status quo. This is where we are. This is what we know. This is where our words really have meaning for us. And now the idea is, okay, what are the directions we can move in from here? It's not about getting to a destination that we see out there, some kind of like specific goal. It's more just like improvement from where we are, and a sense of improvement where we are. Now that might sound pretty inspiring, but can still be very cohesive and kind of inspiring when you feel that, like, well, on a lot of different fronts, that is to say, a lot of different areas of policy, you feel that there are strong arguments that apply that suggest movement in a specific direction, namely the liberal direction. So I still think you can have a quite coherent liberal vision, even if you're thinking about reform from the status quo.
This word liberal, I mean, this is one of these things that I think I have to address with you in particular pretty much out of the gate. The word liberal, I mean, that's what you would like to describe yourself as. And perhaps you do. But to describe yourself as liberal in 2018 will cause the vast majority of people to think something that you're not thinking.
Correct. At least especially in North America. I think that's not too difficult to manage. You could say classical liberal, and that should help.
I hear that a lot from libertarians, but I don't necessarily know that it crosses over and people grasp what that means. Why don't you take a step back as we're describing Hume and Smith, and we've mentioned Hayek and whatnot. Talk about how this term got changed. Because look, you and Paul Krugman in the room, both calling yourselves liberal, something's got to give there.
So let's go back even earlier, before it had a political meaning. So through truly the ages, liberal had a pre-political meaning, and you can think of it in two respects. It was the kind of virtues and activities and practices of free men, as it were, as opposed to slaves. The kind of things that were becoming of a free man to pursue and know something about. That's where we get the idea of liberal arts and liberal education, liberal occupations, liberal sciences. And that goes just centuries and centuries back. Related to that is liberal, again, in a pre-political sense, of just generous or magnanimous, of being charitable, liberal. So that was what liberal, those two things essentially are what liberal meant up until a change that occurred in about 1770, when a couple of Scottish writers in particular started using the term to describe their political outlook, which was towards greater individual liberty, greater free enterprise, particularly in commercial things. William Robertson, a Scottish historian who was very famous in his day, he started doing this in 1769 in one of his books. Adam Smith picked up on it very significantly in The Wealth of Nations, 1776. You might wonder, well, how can I know that it really starts there? I've looked very thoroughly through all of the material, for example, at Liberty Fund's online Library of Liberty. It's very easy to search on liberal. I've had graduate students do this quite systematically. You just don't find the word liberal being used in this political sense. And the kind of phraseology is things like liberal government, liberal plan, the liberal plan, liberal policy, and so on. Liberal system was another important one. And you just don't find it. You know, the search power is so great today with Google and Ngrams and everything else. It's very clear that it really does start right around Adam Smith time. And when Adam Smith, his book was a tremendous sensation as soon as it came off the presses. And people very directly started saying, yeah, now we have a word for this outlook that we've all sort of sensed around us and have been thinking, even if we don't entirely agree with it, liberal. And people started saying liberal system, liberal plan, liberal government, liberal policy, liberal views. And you just see it in the language analysis. So that's what liberal first meant. It was very much Adam Smith's kind of thinking, and it spread to other countries, the use of the word in that sense. It was not directly associated with democracy or with, more widespread voting and even republicanism. It was more specifically about sort of this policy view. It does evolve later to also include stuff about democracy, republicanism, voting, and so on. But I would say that straight up through basically to Gladstone, then, liberal primarily means sort of the Adam Smith view on public policy and the role of government. There's a liberal party in Britain. That's essentially what their character was. Very important reforms that way. And that kind of period I would call the liberal era, sort of the 18th century, or maybe the second half of the 18th century through till later in the 19th century, you might say, is the liberal era, not in the sense that there's a comprehensive liberal policy or something like that, but just that those ideas are ascendant and popular. The Liberal Party in Britain held power. Gladstone was prime minister for the Liberal Party 4 different times. That's not to say 4 complete terms, but at 4 different times. That's kind of what liberal meant in the original political sense, liberalism 1.0, if you will. And then it changes meaning at the end of the 19th century.
Around the 1880s, somewhere in there?
Yes. There's a huge intellectual change in that period. There's basically like a growing dissatisfaction with liberalism. Like, gee, this said it was going to make us happy. And we woke up and we're still not happy. And, and then there was turning against it. I think that for complex reasons I don't pretend to understand, but I think that, the idea of the nation state and the democratic nation state very much came forward. I think this clicked into people's kind of instinctual bents and mentalities about sort of political community, kind of bents and mentalities and instincts that I actually think go back to our ancestral band past, evolutionary, kind of the Hayek thesis about the atavism of political collectivism. So I think somehow that really clicked and came forward in the late 19th century and led to a whole shift in thinking and in the meaning of the most important words in the liberal civilization, words like justice, liberty, liberal, property, contract, rights, equity, equality, and so on. I actually think we've sort of been in confusion ever since that big intellectual shift around the beginning of the 20th century. And so that's really the watershed to me of a big change, if you like, Western political thought.
So if we were to take just a population, it could be any group of people, let's say it's a healthy mix of North Americans, 50% quote Democrat, 50% quote Republican. I just think when I go down the path of your career, I look at all of the economic heroes going back over the centuries. If the average person is exposed to this thought, exposed to the idea of liberty, to being an individual, I don't think people become unhappy about that. I think something else has happened. If you could take this population I'm talking about, they could be in your classroom and you could expose them to the idea of liberty. Do you think at the end of that training and whatnot that 50% would kind of revert back to where they were at, which was like, hey, I don't want this liberty stuff. Just give me the government.
Well, I've done a lot of teaching of introductory principles courses, and I'm very upfront about my political judgments. I don't beat around the bush. I don't pretend that economics agrees, that all economists agree. And I give them a very clear free market line, give them the arguments to the best of my capability. I do think it has an effect on a large number of them, but I don't necessarily think it's a large effect. And I don't think I persuade the vast majority in a significant way or in an enduring way. I do think that people's political bents are, first of all, are quite stubborn once they're formed. And I also think it could be that they're really almost instinctually directed. I wouldn't say like genetically directed, but I do think that we are from the ancestral band. We have bents and mentalities that the big government idea, or that essentially lead one to types of thinking which, even if they don't recognize it as favoring big government, in fact, lead to big government. Let's put it this way. I think we're sort of red on the inside, and that being liberal is in a way almost unnatural. Like David Hume used to say, that in sort of the original state of humankind, language would be unnatural. They hadn't learned language, learned how to speak. And so language is an emergence that depends on learning things. And I think that liberal thought is similar that way.
We should clarify here, when you're saying liberal thought, are we in the Adam Smith Hume liberal thought, or are we in the modern era American liberal thought?
Adam Smith liberal thought, if you like, libertarian thought, classical liberal thought. I think that is a hard thing to get people to really accept and stand up for. It could be that people's way of trying to see meaning in life doesn't jive well with that, because the kind of social vision of liberal thought is so non-encompassing, it's so non-communitarian. And I think that we naturally have these instinctual bents towards a very kind of communitarian understanding of existence, of our own self and meaning.
Fair statement, but our modern human history is littered with, okay, let's cooperate, let's bring the group together, let's do big things as the group, and then the next thing you know, you've got people at the top of the group doing pretty bad things. And it seems like, yes, you're probably right that we go back and we want to hearken to that band, but it has problems, which gets us right back to the inspirations that I'm sure guys like Smith and Hume were looking at him when they were developing their theories and whatnot.
I think that's absolutely right. So I think that the results of big government are very important in making people cautious, waking them up to this isn't a good way to go. So it's a constant tension and struggle between the two tendencies. But another way to think about what people want is that they look for some kind of resolution or final validation of how life is, how to think about life, what is the good, what is virtue. Once you tell them, oh, there can be no definitive political community, there can be no final us that resolves those matters, people are upset about sort of like the infinite regress, if you like, that liberalism leaves them with. They say, what do I believe in? I believe in my church. Well, why should I believe him? He's just another competitor on the church marketplace telling me this and that. Should I believe in, this thinker out there and this author? He's just another talking head, and I don't really believe in that. And so everything seems to be just another opinion, as it were. I mean, not to say that people don't think than others. They have trouble kind of feeling assured of what they are, who they are, what's important to them, what they should be pursuing in life. And that's just like this very natural fear and we have this yearning to somehow overcome that, dispose of that, feel settled. And I think we had that in the ancestral band because, we're like 40 people, and the sense of what the consensus was and what our way of life was just, clear to the individual. It was kind of like waking up in an army unit, and you knew what to do in the morning. You knew what to do with your life every day. I'm just suggesting that there's a very fundamental tension between the, if you like, atavistic side, which I think drives people towards statism, and then sort of like the understanding and the results of statism, like you just said, which is like, hey, wait a second. If we go for that actually spells bureaucracy, restrictions, lousy results, arbitrary rules, lousy life. So we can't do that. I think it's, if you like, there's kind of a basic struggle between those forces.
Why, though? I'm curious. Yourself, your peers, your associates, so many people you know in your life. I'm going to throw my name in the hopper too. Why does this not bother you? You're able to exist and operate. You don't have this thing that you're describing the masses having this desire for this kind of this community group. And you clearly don't have this. So why do you not have it? What triggered in you? What clicked?
I don't know if you could say, gee, there's different dispositions in people, as it were, genetically. I think that's possible. That's not to say anything about, different races or different genders or any of that, just that there's variation among the humankind, the human family, and that some people are somehow more willing to, I don't know, go against that, if you like, atavistic vein. It could also have to do with personal history about what you get exposed to. Like I was telling you about my friend in the ping pong match when I was about 13 or 14, and what he said to me over the ping pong game. And we never know but then, we don't know if that was decisive or if I was genetically disposed to receive that or to be in that position to hear that. So I don't know. I really ask myself this question all the time. I don't have a great understanding about why more people don't agree with me.
You throw it out there that there could be some genetic element to it. I might throw it out there that it's more the tabula rasa, it's the blank slate, and that perhaps it's the exposure at some point in time. I was not necessarily exposed to these thoughts, and I've not done the level of work that you have done by any stretch, but I'm a good Ayn Rander, and I have a certain perspective, and I've done some reading. I just felt like for the longest time I had a splinter in my brain where something wasn't right. It just didn't make sense that the individual was not the highest position, because then ultimately it leaves it to the individual to, oh my gosh, I can exert more energy, I can work harder, I can produce. This opportunity exists for everyone, and for everyone not to see it and to not want it. I just went through many years in my youth wondering, what is going on? This makes no sense. Why does everyone just want, quote, the job? Why does everyone just, quote, trust the government? And I just had until I got slowly exposed to some of the worlds that you are talking about right now.
Well, what do you think is the explanation? Just that people haven't been enough exposed?
When you see, for me, when I see, and I've seen this multiple times, when I see individuals inside the government use government power, and these aren't things, and I'm not talking about things in the news, but things that I've seen personally. When you see people inside the government use government power for their own personal gain, for me, it's game over. I don't care anymore. I'm out, because I'm just like, I've seen behind the curtain. I know what Oz is doing. It's not pretty. Humans are humans. And look, I grew up in Northern Virginia. I still own a house in you teach in the hotbed. I mean, that's ground zero for folks that don't share the beliefs that I have.
So you're saying that everybody could have come around to more classical liberal views, but they get caught up in cultures and activities that depend on thinking otherwise, and they go along with that. Is that kind of your...
I do think it's something similar to that. I don't think, for example, even though I know from, let's say, 1990 to 2018, in Fairfax County, Virginia, one of the wealthiest counties in the country, the voting pattern has shifted from, let's say, 70% voting Republican, today probably over 70% Democrat. That shift, I don't think that makes these groups of people bad or anything, right? But look, Washington, D.C. is the eternal nipple. It just gives mother's milk and it never stops. And, people start to understand that, and they say, okay, you know what? I can buy myself a McMansion. My kids can go to good schools. I've got a nice mall here. I think a lot of that basic stuff drives it. And then, unfortunately, the things that you dive deep into in your career, which I think are so terribly important for us to be thinking about and having broader conversations about, it just becomes, I don't have time for that stuff. I don't have time for that stuff.
It could be. I don't pretend to know myself about the sort of sources, origins. It seems like so many of the intellectuals, though, career-wise, I don't think their condition depends on them maintaining a more collectivist or interventionist view. So why don't they move more in our direction, as it were? You could say that actually their condition would be affected because of all their associations, all their friendships would be upset by their doing that. And I think that's true. I don't know. It's a very big question. But I think the whole stretch of history that we've talked about, let's talk about from the 1700s through to today, does raise this momentous question of like, why was there a liberal ascendancy? Why was there a time when actually the liberal ideas came forward, moved forward, were accepted, did reform government policy in that direction, and then the big reversal?
Fear. At some point in time, fear, and fear is contagious.
Fear caused the reversal, you're saying?
It was probably, the enterprising leader that realized that, okay, I can rile some people up on this particular issue. Maybe it started small. You get political support. Democracies are starting to really gain in power and whatnot. You can see it snowballing. And look, you're close to the city. You know that the whole city is driven by people who make promises. For those promises, they get to sit in a big office in downtown in Congress and, do things.
I don't know. I do think that the rise of democracy is a big part of this long historical story we're trying to figure out, because ideas of democracy got associated with liberal ideas. But I think that democracy per se doesn't imply liberal policy at all, and in fact may, in many cases, work against it.
That's a really critical point.
Yeah, and democracy is a huge shift. Americans don't realize how much sort of mass democracy was not sort of the vision of the founding fathers at all. And it's only something that came quite later.
The tyranny of the majority was not thought through.
They talked about it, but they were worried about it.
And before this conversation, I jotted down one of these quotes that I love from Tocqueville. Everybody feels the evil, but no one has the courage or energy to seek the cure. And perhaps to some degree, that's also a great explanation for what you and I are tossing back and forth. Maybe everyone kind of knows that this isn't right, and I think people are good people. I think maybe they kind of know that this, but then again, that there's the kids got to go to the game and I don't have time and I'm working too many hours and I'm not sleeping and on Friday night I'm going to go party and this and that,
But again, you might ask yourself, well, why didn't that also prevent the original liberal ascendancy? Like, why wasn't that also keeping liberalism back and down in the 18th, 19th century?
But this was also a fairly, if we were to speak openly, and I think this is a fair statement, that was unfolding in a pretty homogenous group, wasn't it?
In terms of each nation?
Well, I mean, for example, like in Scotland in the 1700s, that's a pretty tight-knit group, isn't it?
Certainly by today's standards. But still, people have their children's whatever activities of the day to tend to. I'm just saying that, yeah, I mean, those issues might pertain. Can I go back into something else you said?
Yeah, sure. You could take it anywhere.
What you said about that the individual is uppermost or primary. I'm not quite sure how you put it. That kind of line actually doesn't fit Hume and Smith that well in some respects. They very clearly believe in the holiness of the whole, which is to say that the whole is more important than the individual. That's another kind of shift that, I came to. Again, my 20th century libertarian bearings sort of, resisted at first. Hume and Smith and that whole age, they very much see that like the good of the whole is more important than the good of the individual. That's what I mean by the holiness of the whole. But they argued that sort of allowing the individual freedom, as long as he doesn't mess with other people's stuff, is actually good for the whole. it's by virtue of the holiness of the whole that they defend individual liberty the way they do. It's not just some sort of like, oh, the individual is paramount, has his rights, come what may, the rest of you bug off, and that's the argument. They're much more consequentialist, if you like. And so that's another kind of difference, you might say, between some of the strands of libertarianism today and the 18th century liberal.
Does it drive you crazy if somebody says, I'm socially liberal and fiscally conservative?
No, it doesn't drive me crazy. Why would it?
I guess if we're sitting here talking about the use of the word, because I mean, the classical liberal would not phrase it that way necessarily. I mean, we're only saying socially liberal in the modern USA version of the word liberal.
Depending on what they mean by being socially liberal, that could even mean Adam Smith liberal. If they're saying, I think people should be allowed to smoke pot, have their own sexual affair or, decisions. And so in some respects, it could even be classical liberal. If they're saying socially liberal, so there should be all these laws against discrimination, and so on, or if socially liberal means we should have welfare state policies and so on, it's just not clear what they mean when they say they're socially liberal.
Why have you fought so much, though, for it? You have really, I've seen some of your presentations and whatnot. Why have you fought so much to really retake the word liberal, so to speak?
I do believe that the change that occurred, if you like, from 1880 to let's just say 1940 to be inclusive, this kind of huge cultural shift, especially in the semantics of the central words of our civilization, that is really the turning point, and that the meaning of the words changing or just being diluted and lost is kind of like the critical thing. Unless we're aware of that, we're sort of going to go on in kind of this language trap of, arguing things, and we can still argue things and be effective and show that interventionist policy wreaks bad consequences and so on. But I just feel that, like, to really understand the whole arc of liberal civilization, you need to see what happened then and understand and see the original meaning of the words and then how they changed. And by the way, I do find today that in the discourse on TV and so on, people do use liberal, the word liberal, less often when they refer to Dems and leftists.
Progressives is the word, right?
Progressives, leftists, left-wingers, sometimes Dems, and so on. And so actually, it does seem like people are talking about it more as the left, which I think is very exciting.
That's a shift that's taken place due to the left, though. They have adopted the word, for example, the left or Dem or progressive, and have abandoned liberal to some degree. You make a good point there.
I think that might be true, and it's also true that Bernie Sanders and so on suggests that calling them left and conjuring up the idea of actually being like a socialist or democratic socialist is actually more fitting. It's not exaggerating as much as it might have been in the past. In that sense, too, it's more fitting, and maybe that's one of the explanations why commentators more often just say left. In the materials that you referred to, my major plea, my major request is to not call leftists liberal. I'm not so much asking people to, whether they're conservatives or libertarians or whoever they call themselves, I'm not so much asking those people to call themselves liberal as much as just not to call the left liberal. Calling the left liberal is the gift that keeps on giving. It's such a benefit to the left to be called liberal, and they've benefited immensely from it. They can kind of pretend that somehow they are the evolution and outgrowth of the original liberalism. as though, oh, Adam Smith, he was a great guy. He valued certain things for society, and I'm in the same vein as him. I have the same goals as him. It's just the times have changed and the proper policies are now different. Different conditions call for different policy solutions. And so I am all part of that grand, glorious liberal tradition. And I think, letting them do that, plus think about what liberal meant in the pre-political senses, the virtues and beauties and becoming activities of a free man, generous, magnanimous. I mean, think of all the words that have this strong, favorable connotation. Liberal arts, liberal sciences, and so on. You're giving so much away by calling them liberal. And the word liberal, if you think about it, does still have, even in North America, some of its old sense. For example, when we speak of liberalizing something, I think calling them left is just spot on, because left in English language discourse has only ever meant sort of collectivist political policy and so on.
I hope when people are listening right now, when they hear you speak, yes, you have a very particular political view. You have a certain economic perspective. But what you've just described in the last 2 minutes isn't hey, my name is Daniel, I'm trying to ram my politics down your throat. It's more like, hey, let's at least agree on what these words mean. Let's at least agree what Smith and Hume put down. And let's just at least all be honorable to not mix and match it. And if somebody is coming from a left perspective or a progressive perspective, that could be very well fine for them. But let's at least all agree to define these things so we know what the hell they are.
The spirit of that is spot on in talking to others of the non-left. The idea that I'm going to say that to the left and they're going to say, okay, sure, let's revert to the pre-1880 meanings, like there's no way that they would go for that. That would essentially be an ideological conversion for that person. In some sense, that's almost like the defining characteristic of being left is buying into the new meanings or rejecting at least the old meanings of those important words.
I have many friends on the left. I've had some really interesting guests from the left that have appeared on this show that I'm sure that if I had you and them on the same stage, it'd be a fantastic, interesting debate. For example, the likes of a Steven Pinker or Cass Sunstein, we'd have I'd love to do the moderation on that debate. That'd be so much fun, right?
Yeah, that would be fun. Pinker, I think, is pretty close to our type of thinking. He has that left pole analogy, which I think is very, very illuminating. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
He did a little clip of this in one of his talks, and it's been segmented as a little short video. I think it's extremely powerful. He says the left pole is a sort of mythical place, kind of like the North Pole, where when you're there, you're at the left. And then if you go away from that in any direction, you're going south, you're going right. And I think that's a great way to think about left and right, that the left is actually pretty coherent or cohesive outlook and tendency, and it gets kind of defined with respect to what are the going dominant political parties in that context.
Bingo. That's it right there.
No, but it's still got a broader kind of spirit to it, and I would again invoke the whole sort of band man, ancestral band tendencies. So in any given country, in any given time, there's going to be sort of the more left parties of that nature, and the parties then in that specific discourse will give some of the fine points about what a proper leftist is. And then the point is that any deviation from that, any significant deviation from that in any direction, not necessarily a classical liberal direction, any deviation from that is right. It's not actually like right versus left along a line. it's more like this complex thing of there's a place that's left, like the North Pole, and any movement away from that, they call right. So the real distinction is left and non-left, not left and right.
You know, it's as I said, Cass, and as I said, Steven Pinker, I was also thinking of three more names that I've not had on the show, but they remind me, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Bill Maher. Now, these are three guys, too, to put in there with Sunstein and Pinker. These are all very smart people. And if I was to tell, for example, a typical Republican audience, like, hey, these guys might have something interesting for you to listen to, they would immediately say, no way, because they know their political, these men that I've mentioned would often say who they might vote for politically. It would cause a GOP audience to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. But it's been interesting over the years for me to watch some conservative or even libertarian people finally hear something that a Bill Maher might say and say, oh, hold on, I agree with him. So you're right. There's the left that's highly political, and then there are the intellectuals that are really kind of in that libertarian space, but then they choose, a left candidate, and that causes confusions for people to try and understand them. At least that's my particular take on it.
I think of the GOP as somewhat of a non-left coalition. Again, I think that the left and the Dems are more cohesive, and I could point you to data which show this, that they are more bunched up in their policy views. They're more coherent, whereas the Republican voters are more diverse in their policy views. And so I think it's useful to think of the Republican side, the Republican voters are the people who root for the Republicans. And I would put myself in that category. I mean, I think the less bad party is the Republican Party. Not that I've ever voted for Republicans, actually, though. But the point is that I think that the Team Republican is more of a coalition of non-left types. They can be traditionalists, conservatives, they can be nativists and nationalists. They can be kind of like status quo business interest types. They can be Bill Buckley conservatives, they can be libertarians. So if you think about the diversity, it's much greater. And all of those groups I just said have some element which moves them away from that left pole. But it's not always the same element. And so because they're moving out of the left pole, the left says, you're a bad guy, you're not one of us. What are you? You're the right. It's kind of like the Romans. Like, if you're not in Rome, what are you? You're a barbarian. All the rest of the world, even though they're very diverse, they're all barbarian.
I think you really have a very nice way of bringing this up in conversation, because it becomes, I don't know about most people, but for me, it becomes, an Excedrin number 9 headache to listen to the constant nonsense of U.S. Political debate. But if we can kind of take a step back and start to kind of say, we got some commonalities over here, we got some differences here. Let's talk about what liberalism really means going back in time. Let's bring in some of the philosophers from Scotland back in the 1700s. That's a much more interesting conversation. I wish we could have that more often.
That's what we're trying to do in our program at George Mason. This whole business about, the left versus the non-left, I mean, I think that helps perhaps to explain why I think it's important that the left be called left, because then the sense that, well, the rest of us who sort of don't go for the Democratic Party, don't go for that vision, we're non-left, and we're more like a coalition.
It's a coalition that doesn't necessarily always agree. I mean, look, for example, what happened with Trump rising to the top. Oh my gosh, you've got the Republican Party in chaos.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people who supported Trump because they just had this sense that they were getting suffocated by the left. It was getting totally out of hand. And they saw how up yours to political correctness Trump was. And they just said, whatever else we've got to do something about this suffocation and domination by the left. Let me just add, so look, if they were called, if the Dems and the progressives are called liberal, that doesn't work for the rest of us to define ourselves as the non-liberal.
Yep.
Whereas the rest of us defining ourselves as some form of non-left works.
And people might think that you and I are just being, sticks in the mud here, and you in particular, because you really are driving this stake home. But I think it's a really important distinction in these semantics. This really helps to communicate if we can all agree that these words are not variable, that can mean anything at any point in time and all that kind of stuff. But look, as far as I can tell right now, 50% of America loves the idea that everything is variable. Oh, you got a law there? Oh, there's 10 variables in that law. That just means the commissar can determine what the variable means at the time of arrest or whatever. People love having that never-ending ability to not define something.
I agree that, attitudes vary greatly.
Hey, listen, I can't keep you. I promised you for an hour. Where can we send people, Daniel? You're an easy Google away to find, but is there a particular website you want to point people to?
If people just Google Daniel Klein, GMU, they'll find me directly.
I didn't think when I graduated from a suburban Northern Virginia college back in 1991, I did not think that all these years later it would be this really fascinating place where all these like-minded folks have gravitated to. It's quite a very fast transition to where, and apparently there's no stopping, so I love it. It's great.
Well, thanks for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.